Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2. This week, our topic is people are different, and we're going to be learning not only about how people are different through the lesson materials that we read and watch this week, but also through our first challenge, which will challenge us to meet and talk with a stranger. So this week, one of the first things that you'll be engaging with is the lesson video, the lesson one video from Dr. Mike Wesch. And in this video, he gives us 3 different stories as kind of an introduction to Mike Wesch's involvement in the field of anthropology and his first experiences doing cultural anthropological research. And many of us, like Mike, will learn the most about our own lives and our own sense of self, and about others by going out in the world and following our excitement and interests in other people and different perspectives that they share with us. So 4 things to keep in mind as we watch this video and things that he will touch on is that people are different even within the same group or culture of people. Another thing to keep in mind is that the answers to our questions are found in places that are unfamiliar and unknown to us. This leads us to new questions about the world and answers that we could have never imagined prior to really getting more comfortable and talking and investigating that which is unknown and unfamiliar. The next thing to keep in mind here is that when in the space of the unknown, we will disrupt our own worldviews and get us to reflect and see what it is we are seeing, right? This is what he says, see what we are seeing. And we must first break out of our ethnocentrism and open up to the world of cultural relativism. This is something that he will talk about and you'll read about this week in your chapter reading. And then lastly, something to keep in mind is that we want to connect through being thoughtful, being empathetic and open to what someone has to say. Also participating and being vulnerable, trying new things. This is all going to help us take care and trying to establish deeper connections and meaningful relationships by getting involved and forcing yourself out of the analytical mindset of what something means or where this might come from. And even outside of yourself as a person who may be entirely shocked or rendered vulnerable in a situation that you do find really interesting, you just might feel uncomfortable engaging in. And that is a huge lesson to be learned from Dr. Mike Wesch's experiences in Papua New Guinea. Instead of seeing yourself in the center of the story, we're going to break out and try new things, meet new people, hear new perspectives, and challenge yourself to see a bigger picture and the possibilities that you have yet to consider for yourself. So one thing that I wanted to do this week was to share a story from Guam in the fieldwork that I have been involved with here in attempts to propose my own project. Like I said previously, this week we'll be exploring the world of difference that exists in our social realities. And an immediate way to do so is to meet and converse with someone that you don't know. Not only are we challenged to put ourselves out there and with someone we might consider a stranger, but we are also challenged to move beyond small talk with our new acquaintances and explore deeper questions about who that person is and the cultural background, which plays such an integral role in making them who they are. Some questions that might be considered small talk are often still important, especially when meeting someone for the first time. This helps us open up to bigger questions that will give us a richer insight into that person and their views of the world, and therefore their cultural background. So I wanted to use an example from my own field experiences in Guam to sort of showcase this process over the course of meeting someone new. When I first arrived in Guam, I knew next to no one on the island. And that slowly but surely changed as I met people through my job and the people that they knew on the island. It was through this process of getting to know more people in a place I didn't really know anyone that my example for how to work into the anthropological process of question asking emerges from. In April of 2021, I was given an invitation from my coworker who was more plugged into the local community in Guam than I to give a testimony to the Guam legislative body during a public hearing about the treatment of archaeological grave and burial settings and the protocols that should be taken into consideration in those settings. It was through this testimony that I ended up meeting for the first time a key informant in the ethnographic project that I'm now proposing for my dissertation work. His name is Mr. Joe Kanata, and he is a director of a nonprofit organization in Guam called the Guam Preservation Trust that specializes in historic preservation. And he also happens to be Indigenous Chamorro. After the hearing had concluded, Mr. Kanata invited me to dinner, where he and I had some of our first conversations. And my project idea really began to form and come into my consciousness at this point through these conversations. So the notes that I have taken from that night are notes that record a lot of basic information about Mr. Kanata and what the organization that he is the director of does. Basically what their mission is and some of the projects that they have been able to accomplish. However, I end up getting into some deeper questions than this, even in our first conversation. And this kickstarted some of the ideas for a larger research project. He told me about the historic buildings in Guam, most of which are influenced by Spanish colonization in the colonial period in Guam that existed for roughly 350 years before the U.S. acquired Guam as a territory in 1989, an unincorporated territory. He told me about how his organization rehabilitated and in some cases reconstructed the historic buildings in different villages. And he told me about the different villages that this was done in. He also told me about a teaching curriculum that his organization helped design with teachers on Guam that centered a place-based lesson structure whereby students would travel to historic places in Guam to learn about the history and heritage of those places alongside the chapter textbook that had been produced and designed with the teachers for this project. He proceeded to tell me about 4 other projects in total and the Guam Preservation Trust as they had a hand in each of these projects. And through learning about them, I realized that there was a much deeper idea that was influencing each of the projects. And at first, it appeared that engaging the local populations on Guam with their history and heritage was a part of that idea. So we moved on from this introduction about the Trust's work and started to talk about the work that I had been involved with. This was my first chance to really open up and talk not only about my previous work, but how I felt about it and the direction that I felt pulled to follow in the future. So I told him about my introduction to the field of anthropology and my first projects in archaeology. I also told him about my master's thesis work in Fiji and what that was all about and how that experience really changed my perspective on how archaeology relates to local populations. That's what motivated me to design a dissertation project that had a greater potential to impact the everyday lives of local people, not just for those who visit museums or go to universities. I had realized in Fiji that although it wasn't impossible to see local people in Fiji, taking into account the findings and published work of archaeologists, it was rare. And there was a gap in the utility of archaeological research and the people who live closest to the context where that research comes out of. This realization wasn't anything new, and it was a part of a larger body of critique about archaeology that I came to learn more about in a class offered by Ohio State University's Dr. Robert Cook, a class called Who Owns the Past? But what this did in conversation with Mr. Kanata was open up the conversation about the difficulties that are inherent in this gap or disconnect between research investigations and the everyday lives of people in research settings. At one point, I took a chance to be vulnerable about my ignorance and how this looks in Guam and how this is understood by Mr. Kanata. I came clean and I asked a question all at the same time. I said, I am unsure how I can have a positive impact on the people here in Guam with my skill set that I have acquired at the university. From what I can tell, most of the archaeological work that I am involved with here is controversial to a lot of people, mostly because of the context that it emerges from, the ongoing Marine Corps-based buildup. But I wonder if there's a way to change that for the better, which was the first step, basically, in numerous steps towards understanding the depth of these issues that exist in the field of historic preservation in Guam. And it was mostly because I made known my desire to listen and learn more. That is when Mr. Kanata started to open up to me about the difficulties he has faced in his own career in trying to do just that, to work within difficult settings, but to have a positive impact on the people in Guam at the same time through the preservation of history and heritage. He spoke to me about issues within decision-making processes, project funding, labor force and capacity building, and the dominant issue of property ownership in Guam. Each of these issues had a very deep and complicated conversation attached to it, one that includes the historical trajectory that Guam fits within, the economic industries that most significantly impact Guam, such as tourism and the military. The current socio-political status in Guam as well has a lot to do with the issues involved in the field of historic preservation. Even still, this was the first time I had met Mr. Kanata, and I was able to gain so much insight in just this one conversation. Again, this was the first conversation in a series of many conversations to come. Mr. Kanata proceeded to invite me to join him on what he calls site visits, where we talked more about the field of preservation in Guam, as well as how Chamorro people relate to the settings and subjects that projects in the field are focused on. This was all new experiences to me, new places, things that I had never seen before, with a lot of insight that I hope to convey further to you all in the course of the semester. But nonetheless, I started to learn more and make connections about these issues and how I might investigate them further in an ethnographic project. The process itself of starting with the small talk, making connections to my own life and perspectives, as well as to my curiosities, becoming vulnerable, opening up to learning more and hearing new perspectives, and ultimately asking bigger questions. This became a seamless result throughout the conversational process. That is the process that I hope you all get to experience this week as you go into the world to meet strangers and hear from people who are different than you. You may find that you have more in common than you at first thought. You may find that they have perspectives that illuminate your own perspective. So get excited about meeting someone new, even if they don't see or think the same way as you. Ask questions about those differences. Challenge yourself to make connections in what they say, to understand their logic, and try something new if given the chance. You may be astonished at what you find and what you learn. Beyond this, I wanted to talk about the video this week that we'll be watching from Dr. Mike Wesch in his class, his visual anthropology class, the video titled "Smile Because It Happened." There's a couple of things here, really 3 points that I wanted to talk a bit more about. The first one being that humans are social beings. Most of our lives consist of socialization every day. And without socialization, there would be no human culture. There also would be no learning about different cultures. This is why students of Mike Wesch's class immerse themselves in the world of everyday elderly folks who are living at the Meadowlarks property. And it's the best way to investigate and understand the culture of Meadowlarks by immersing yourself in that setting, and by extension, immersing yourself in the culture of elderly folks in America. Humans are dynamic. This is the second point. They're always changing, and this is meaningful and worth further investigation from an anthropological standpoint, how people and their perspectives have changed over time. This is why student investigators at Meadowlarks find things like the love and relationship among Meadowlark residents to be surprising, like how often they maintain intimate relationships in their latter years of life. This is also why some of the most impactful periods of Meadowlark residents' lives are those times when they undergo extensive changes in their lives in relationship to their significant others or loved ones, such as when they lose a spouse, or when they move into Meadowlark and became a part of a new community of people. And we see how that vulnerability, due to the change that these humans must grapple with, bring out a lot of insight on what is important to that person. And then lastly, anthropology is a self-reflective process. No matter what differences people may have among one another, we see that this is nonetheless relatable to our own lives and self-identity in some way. We can see this in an example of the student researcher named Taylor, who unfortunately lost his grandfather during the research project, and it prompted a significant self-reflection from the student about life, death, and the topics that he had been interested in talking to the research participants about. As researchers, we don't always need such a drastic event to occur in order for us to engage in reflection. A lot of times, all it takes is to be met with a different viewpoint than our own. The important thing here is that these are points of learning about the similarities and differences, not just the differences between humans, and how there is always a spectrum of ways that we could explain or relate to the world. Ultimately, this is the self-reflection that prompts vulnerability in Taylor and allows for them to open up to research participants, one in particular named Verda, who he is able to form a bond with. And through Taylor listening to her perspectives about her own vulnerability, grief, and loss of her recent spouse, he was able to identify with that perspective about the people who he was interviewing and who are his research participants. This beautiful moment is one where a lot of anthropological perspective comes full circle. And we see how doing this work is really about doing work that is meaningful to people across generations and across cultures. That same sort of self-reflection, vulnerability, and opening up to discuss things that can be difficult to understand is what allows these student researchers in this project to really understand the depth of the lessons that can be learned from doing ethnographic work in a nursery home setting. In the end, it was not just about the perspectives that were recorded from the research participants that developed the researchers' perspectives, but also what they learned about themselves and from their fellow student researchers that really brought together their conclusions on the project. So as we move forward this week with our first challenge, where we will each have an experience meeting a stranger, I want you to keep all of this in mind, that oftentimes it is the perspectives that are different than our own, or perhaps surprising, that yield the most meaningful understandings about a human being or their culture. It's what gets us into those bigger questions, moves us beyond the small talk. Also, becoming vulnerable and engaging with those who are interested in interviewing or knowing more about you, perhaps by sharing about yourself or your experiences, opens up discussion for insight from someone who has different perspectives and comes from a different background or culture than you, and may even still be similar to you in surprising ways. And that can help you to further understand the spectrum of diversity that human beings exist within, and ultimately allow you to build a more accurate and relatable way to explaining cultures or people. And that is really what leads to good anthropological work. So I hope you're excited for this week's first challenge. And when I hear back from you all to come in this challenge, I'm really excited to see what your experiences are like. So that's all I have for the announcement this week. And I look forward to hearing from you all again. As they say here in Guam, esta. Adios.